Now looking past the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, the White House officials now confirming to Fox News that they are in the early stages of planning a potential face-to-face sit-down between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. This, of course, comes amid Special Counsel Robert Mueller's ongoing investigation into the Russian influence and interference in the 2016 presidential election, a topic that would certainly come up if both these world leaders sit down together. So what can we expect if this does come off, this summit does occur? Well, Dr. Rebecca Grant is a national security and military analyst and also president of IRIS, Independent Research. So, Dr. Grant, you've got a Twitter photo on your Twitter, which is fascinating. It shows Gorbachev and Reagan meeting for the first time, I guess, in 1985. And you write in it that there was lots of shouting. Can you tell us about that? Because it's kind of enticing to think of President Trump. I mean, he is a New Yorker. He's a guy from Queens. He is blunt. He is direct. He is very frank. He's going to take no guff, from Putin. I think he would sit right directly and tell him what he thinks.
And he can be very smooth. So what happened with Reagan and Gorbachev in Geneva was, Gorbachev wanted to talk about Star Wars. Reagan wanted to talk about human rights. It went on over 2 days, and there were shouting matches that occurred. And one would say, oh, I rant and rave and get up. But in the end, the two leaders set the path towards another 3 summits and some wonderful arms control treaties. So a summit is a good thing.
I would worry if they were shouting, but I guess it turned out okay. But in this day and age, you've got Syria, you've got Russian support of Assad, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. You've got the election interference that the intelligence community certainly said happened. All these actions, as well as Russian meddling throughout the world, Sergei Lavrov going off to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong-un to try to, gum up the works in this potential summit. So what does change, if anything, in terms of Russian behavior?
Well, let's roll it back. So Trump mentioned in March that he was open to a summit with Putin. And, Putin is in a tough spot. His economy is very weak. It's smaller GDP than California's. He's been very militarily aggressive. So there are a number of things that Putin and Trump should talk about. Syria is top of the list. Also the situation in Ukraine. And let's not forget, Eric, that Russia has some very, very nasty cyber capabilities. The FBI warned us just this week to turn off our routers because of a Russian-linked Fancy Bear hacking group. So there are a number of things that Russia is doing to destabilize everything from the cyberspace to nuclear weapons development. They have a lot to talk about, and that's why I'd be in favor of seeing them sit down and talk at some point in the future.
Well, would that deter Putin's objectives and the actions that the Russians are taking at our expense?
I wouldn't expect one discussion to fix anything, but I can understand why Trump would want to meet personally with Putin in a one-on-one format. They've had a couple of smaller meetings and really see where the potential is. Listen, at some point they are going to have to talk about the outcome in Syria. There's no getting around that. And we've seen some hints from the Russian side that they may want to talk a little bit about arms control at some point in the future, as amazing as that sounds. So the agenda is so big that I think it would be very appropriate. I wouldn't expect this to change Russian behavior immediately, but we have to keep up that strong military deterrent and then see what outcome we can look for.
And what would you see in terms of Syria? I mean, Assad's not going anywhere.
Right, exactly. But the fact is that we cannot withdraw coalition forces from Syria really until we see some diminishing of Russian and Iranian activity in that sphere. We have to talk with Russia on a frequent basis about deconflicting our forces. Don't forget that our air forces face the Russians almost every day. We'll see Russian jets trying to maneuver around our air forces, and our air forces usually lock them up, okay? But that's something that we have to look at. So there has to be some discussion. There are plenty of issues with Syria to discuss. And then ultimately, we need to see Russia, as George Kennan said, contained. They're going to behave badly. We need to contain them.
And we apparently struck out and killed a bunch of Russian contractors a few weeks ago when there was an alleged attack on one of our bases. Finally, you mentioned Fancy Bear. Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear authorities say, or GRU intelligence services that actually hacked into our election system. They hacked into the Illinois election system during the 2016 presidential election. Here's what the Wall Street Journal says about that and the Russian interference. Quote, a meeting that would bring to the international stage one of the world's most enigmatic political relationships. Meeting Mr. Putin last year on the sidelines of the G20 summit meeting in Germany, Mr. Trump voiced concerns about Russian interference in the election. Then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said at the time, Mr. Putin, during a 2-hour meeting that lasted twice as long as planned, denied any involvement. So, you know, what do you do when Putin's sitting right next to you and he goes, well, we didn't do anything. That's not us. It's all, you know, propaganda. And, you know, how does it stop?
Isn't that typical KGB, GRU behavior? But the fact is that we know that Russia is making a strong play to dominate and attack in cyberspace, just as they are with other forms of military electronic warfare that we see in Syria, Ukraine, and other places. So this is one of the big issues. It's like the arms control of the 1980s. Now cyberspace and behavior in cyberspace has to be part of that very contentious discussion.
The arms control of the 1980s, perfectly said Dr. Rebecca Grant. Thank you, as always.
Thank you.
Of course. Arthel?